President Vladimir Putin saying that Russia will fight for its interests to the end. His interview with Tucker Carlson was posted on X last night and viewed more than 155 million times. Another 8.7 million views have been tallied on YouTube. Within the 2-hour-long discussion, Putin mocked Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy for taking part in a tribute in Canada on Parliament Hill that included a veteran with Nazi ties. Russian President Vladimir Putin sitting down with former Fox News host Tucker Carlson and criticizing Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy for joining in a standing ovation next to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau for a Nazi soldier while visiting Canada.
The president of Ukraine himself, by the way, is a Jew by nationality.
Putin has repeatedly claimed he is waging war on Ukraine in order to denazify the country.
He will, of course, use whatever propaganda he can engage in. But I can tell you, Canadians will not be fooled.
Trudeau was asked today about the interview and the national embarrassment of bringing an SS soldier to Parliament.
Canada stands with Ukraine, not just because we are friends to Ukraine, but because the rules-based order and the system of laws and the UN Charter protect all of us, not just Ukrainians.
Aside from speaking on the Liberals' blunder, Putin focused on the war with Ukraine. Asked if he could imagine a scenario in which he would send Russian troops to Poland, a NATO member, Putin replied with this.
Only in one case, if Poland attacks Russia. Why? Because we have no interest in Poland, Latvia, or anywhere else. Why would we do that? We simply don't have any interest.
Putin spent the vast majority of the interview providing his own history lesson to Carlson.
I understand that my long speeches probably fall outside of the genre of the interview. That is why I asked you at the beginning, are we going to have a serious talk or a show?
Within his chat, Putin said Western leaders had come to realize it was impossible to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia and were wondering what to do next.
Wouldn't it be better to negotiate with Russia? Make an agreement, already understanding the situation that is developing today, realizing that Russia will fight for its interests to the end? And realizing this, actually return to common sense, start respecting our country and its interests, and look for certain solutions.
Putin, clearly controlling the interview, began to complain that Ukraine had been on the verge of agreeing to a deal to end hostilities at talks in Istanbul in April 2022, but backed away, he said, once Russian troops withdrew near Kyiv.
It would be funny if it were not so sad. This endless mobilization in Ukraine, the hysteria, the domestic problems, sooner or later it will result in agreement.
Putin also said he believed it was possible to reach an agreement to free a U.S. journalist who has been detained in Russia for nearly a year.
I just got to ask you one last question, and that's about someone who's very famous in the United States, probably not here, Evan Gershkovich, who's the Wall Street Journal reporter.
Мы столько сделали жестов доброй воли, что, мне кажется, мы исчерпали все линии.
We have done so many gestures of goodwill out of decency that I think we have run out of them.
The Russian dictator ending by saying they won't rule out releasing him if the U.S. takes reciprocal steps. Joining us tonight to weigh in on the interview heard around the world is Timothy Caulfield, professor with the University of Alberta. Timothy, what were your initial thoughts on the interview? Did anything stand out to you?
Well, the whole process is really frustrating. This is an interview by Tucker Carlson, who's clearly using this as an opportunity to build his brand. This is a commentator that lost his job on Fox News. And I think it's important to highlight he lost that job, likely, at least in part, because of his tenuous relationship with the truth and his embrace of conspiracy theories. So this is the Tucker brand. And he goes to Moscow and does this interview. And I think it's really important also to highlight that, Moscow, the Kremlin, and Putin allowed the interview to happen with Tucker because they like Tucker's take on Russia. So, that's the backstory to where we are. Then the interview happens, and it's barely an interview. It really is just an opportunity for Putin to give, sort of Putin's view on the world. And so it's really disappointing it happened, not surprising it happened, but I still worry about the damage it will do.
You briefly touched on it in your answer there. What do Carlson or Putin stand to gain from this?
Yeah, and I do think that it is important to think about that, because what Tucker's trying to do is build basically his brand, but to build an audience and to play to his audience. Tucker knows who his audience is, and I think it's also important to highlight. Tucker is not afraid to play into controversy in order to build a brand, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum, whether you are more right or more left. You just have to recognize that Tucker is a controversial figure because he does lie, and I don't hesitate from using the word lie, because it's been documented in court documents. He's admitted he lies. Putin, of course, has the opportunity to get his perspective across, but I also think that he has a more nefarious goal here. He wants to kind of normalize his view of the war to weaken the support for Ukraine in the United States, specifically amongst the Republicans. And I fear that this might have worked in Putin's favor in that regard.
You mentioned Carlson being a liar, but he didn't really do too much talking in this interview. It was a lot of Putin. Was anything Putin said in this interview true?
Yeah, it was a fascinating interview in that Tucker kind of just raised a topic, a theme, and then Putin went off on it, right? And he tried to justify why Russia it was okay to invade. He tried to make it sound like it was the U.S. was to blame for the war continuing, basically not letting Russia and him win is really what he's saying there. And those themes kept coming up, again and again. And it was interesting because Tucker, as I've watched a lot of Tucker, ouch. He isn't afraid to interrupt. He isn't afraid to be aggressive in his questioning. You saw none of that, really, just that famous Tucker furrowed brow and Putin pontificating, which I think really played to Putin's agenda.
It was definitely interesting, to say the least. Thanks so much for breaking this down with us tonight on Trending Now, Timothy.
My pleasure.